While some children laugh in playgrounds and others attend piano lessons, Emma Thompson lives in silence, an 8-year-old girl born into wealth but trapped in isolation. Her world has no sound, no friends, no one who truly understands her, until a new boy arrives. Tyler Mitchell doesn't wear uniforms or carry designer bags, but he speaks her language. Not just signs, but the language of pain, survival, and quiet strength. What begins as a small connection between two outcasts will unravel secrets, shake reputations, and challenge what it means to be family. Stay with us, because this story may just change the way you see the world. Emma Thompson sat with her back straight on the edge of the schoolyard bench, her hands resting on her lap, eyes scanning the chaotic yet synchronized patterns of other children playing tag, kicking balls, yelling names, and forming alliances she had never been invited into. She watched them not with envy, but with the practiced detachment of someone who had long accepted their position as an outsider. There had been no dramatic moment of exclusion, no cruel bullying. The absence was quieter than that. It was the casual invisibility of a girl who couldn't hear their laughter and who didn't speak their language. For the other students at Halston Academy, Emma existed in the periphery, intelligent, polite, unreachable. The kind of child you smiled at with pity, then avoided. It had been like this since she enrolled 3 years ago, following the sudden death of her father, Marcus Thompson. The tech magnate, whose name graced donor plaques on the school's library and science wing, had tried everything: specialists, interpreters, private sessions with staff, and yet his daughter remained alone. She drew pictures. She read. And mostly she sat, like now, surrounded by people, but profoundly untouched by any of them. Marcus watched her from the second-floor window, his presence obscured behind a reflective pane, arms crossed tightly over his chest. This was his routine every Tuesday: cancel 2 early meetings, drive Emma to school himself, and watch until the bell rang. He'd done this for months, never once seeing her speak to another child. She wasn't withdrawn at home, far from it. With her sketch pads, her books, her notes written in careful block letters, she communicated everything. But out here, in the place where children were supposed to learn connection, her world was utterly sealed off. He'd hired top interpreters, tried to fund ASL programs, even paid for classroom aides. Nothing stuck. No one had made the effort. He felt the weight of his failure like a stone pressing into his ribs. And just as he considered stepping away, preparing himself for another long day of meetings punctuated by guilt, a shift occurred in the corner of his eye, subtle but jarring in its impossibility. A boy, unfamiliar, in a slightly too big uniform and worn-out sneakers, was approaching Emma. And not just approaching, signing. Emma blinked. Once. Twice. She tilted her head, unsure whether her eyes were playing tricks on her. The boy, dark-haired, small for his age, with a backpack that sagged from the weight of too many books, was standing directly in front of her, signing with the ease of someone who lived in the language, not just learned it. "Hi," he signed. "I'm Tyler. You're Emma, right?" Her first instinct was suspicion. Children didn't know how to speak like this. Teachers tried. Therapists fumbled. But kids didn't. "Yes," she replied, hands trembling just slightly. "I'm Emma." There was a pause, a kind of breath held between worlds, and then Tyler smiled. Not the forced smile adults gave her, but one that reached his eyes. He sat beside her, gesturing toward the book on her lap. A copy of The Secret Garden in large print. "I've read that. My brother likes when I act out the parts for him." Emma's hands moved faster now. "You have a brother who signs?" Tyler nodded. "Jake, he's 5, he's deaf too." For a moment nothing else mattered, not the kids playing behind them. Not the confusion in Emma's chest, not even the strange feeling of hope warming her ribs. From the window, Marcus leaned in, confused. He recognized the look on his daughter's face, half disbelief, half joy. Her hands moved like they hadn't in years outside the comfort of home. She laughed, soundless but genuine, her body language entirely open. The boy said something, Marcus couldn't tell what, and Emma covered her mouth to stifle another burst of silent laughter. It was a kind of alchemy happening right in front of him. His daughter, long trapped in a world that no one had entered, was suddenly living, fully, presently, visibly. He glanced toward the courtyard entrance, looking for a staff member, a clue, anything that could explain this unexpected miracle. One of the teachers was watching them too, stunned. "Who is that boy?" Marcus asked aloud to no one. And more importantly, where had he come from? Questions burned through him, but he didn't move. He didn't dare interrupt. Something fragile and sacred was unfolding between those two children, and for the first time in what felt like forever. Marcus was smart enough to stay out of the way. and the only one else here knew how to sign. Emma signed, her fingers moving more confidently now, energy returning to her limbs. Tyler shrugged, modest. I only started this school today. He pulled out a lunchbox from his backpack. The plastic cracked at the corners and opened it to reveal 2 carefully wrapped sandwiches. Want one? She hesitated, then took it. They ate in silence, not the awkward kind, but the kind built on growing trust. Emma, who had eaten alone for 3 years, suddenly had someone to share food with. And not just food, stories, jokes, books. In 20 minutes, Tyler learned more about her than her classmates had in years. And Emma, for the first time since her mother died, felt seen. Not as the deaf girl. Not as Marcus Thompson's daughter, but as Emma, someone worth knowing. When the bell rang, both of them looked up, startled. Tyler stood, brushing crumbs off his lap. See you at recess? He signed. Emma nodded eagerly, holding onto the crust of the sandwich like it was something sacred. Something real. She didn't know it yet, but the entire trajectory of her life had just changed. As the children walked back toward the building, Emma a step behind Tyler, Marcus remained frozen behind the glass, unable to look away. His heart beat hard in his chest, not with anxiety, not this time, but with something closer to awe. He felt it in his bones, the way you feel a storm before it breaks. For years he had tried to manufacture connection for his daughter. He had written checks, hired teams, built programs, and yet none of it had touched her. But here, in the span of less than half an hour, a boy with second-hand shoes and a quiet smile had done the impossible. He had spoken to Emma in her own language, and she had answered. Marcus pressed a hand against the window, grounding himself. She was signing, laughing, flourishing. The silence that had once wrapped itself around his daughter like armor had been broken. Not by wealth or plans or professionals, but by another child, another kindred soul, who knew what it meant to live unheard. And just like that, in the most unexpected of ways, Emma Thompson was finally blooming. Emma couldn't stop talking, not with words, but with her hands, fluid and alive, and with her eyes, which now gleamed with something closer to mischief than melancholy. At recess, the silence that used to envelop her like a second skin was replaced by motion, expression, voice. She signed so rapidly now that her fingers sometimes tangled mid-sentence, and she'd giggle, sign oops, and start over. And Tyler? He understood every single word. There was no stumbling, no hesitation, no wait. What does that mean? The way adults always asked. Instead, he listened like someone who had waited a long time to be understood himself. He took her to the far bench near the fence, the one nobody ever used, and pulled a beat-up notebook from his backpack. The corners were torn, the cover half peeled, but Emma held it like it was sacred. Inside were crude but careful drawings of hands forming signs. Each page was labeled in big block letters, "Hungry, sad bird, Safi." She turned to him slowly, question in her brow. Tyler smiled. I learned for Jake, he signed, tapping the last page, where brother was written beneath a messy stick figure with hearing aids. Emma stared at the page longer than necessary. The paper was worn thin in places, as though it had been touched often, revised, held during quiet moments. The signs weren't perfect, some handshapes were a little off, but the care was unmistakable. She ran her fingers across the word Saf and looked back at Tyler. Is he like me? She asked, her hands moving slower now. Yes, Tyler answered. He's 5. He gets scared when people talk too loud. I used to get mad because I couldn't help him, so I decided to learn how. Emma's throat tightened at word decided. No one had ever chosen to learn her language before. The adults around her had treated a cell like a medical necessity, something they should do, not something they wanted to. But here was a boy, not much older than she was, who had made a choice out of love. And now he was sitting across from her, offering the same love freely, without pity, without performance. You're really good, she signed. Tyler shrugged again, his version of modesty. I mess up a lot, he replied. But Jake always laughs when I get it wrong, so I keep trying. Inside the school building, behind the tinted glass of the administration hallway, Marcus stood at a respectful distance from the classroom door, speaking with Mrs. Henderson. He's new, she explained. Transferred from Lincoln Elementary this week. His records are clean, but... She hesitated. Marcus picked up on it immediately. But, she lowered her voice, he's from Roxbury, public school system. His mother filled out the financial aid paperwork herself. It's no sponsor, no foundation name behind the application. Marcus frowned slightly, not in judgment, more in confusion. Any signs like that? Mrs. Henderson nodded, fluently. Naturally, it's not academic, it's lived. Her voice softened, a note of wonder replacing the usual bureaucratic tone. He's not just good at it, Marcus. He's empathetic. You can see it in how he watches her, not studying her, not performing for her, just being with her. Marcus looked past the woman, out through the narrow window overlooking the recess yard. Emma and Tyler were side by side, their conversation uninterrupted, their movements fluid and synchronized. For the first time, he wasn't watching his daughter struggle to be seen. She was simply being fully, freely, without tension. Curiosity burned inside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this boy than met the eye. So when the final bell rang and students spilled out of the building in loud waves of chatter and backpacks, Marcus stayed behind. He waited near the exit, unsure what he'd say when he saw the boy's parent. He didn't have to wait long. A woman emerged from the line of cars, early 30s, worn jeans, an oversized coat, hair tied back hastily. She walked with determination but also weariness, like someone constantly racing against time. Tyler ran to her, signing excitedly about Emma and recess and something about a pigeon that had landed near them. She laughed, visibly relieved, and signed back. Marcus stepped forward. "Excuse me, are you Tyler's mother?" She turned to face him, surprised, and nodded. "Yes, I'm Sarah." She extended a hand. Her palm was rough, her nails clipped short, as if manicured by necessity. "I'm Marcus Thompson, Emma's father." For a second, recognition flickered behind her eyes, not from his fame, but from the name written in gold on the school donor wall. She smiled politely. "Your daughter's incredible," she said. Tyler couldn't stop talking about her. Marcus offered a careful smile in return. He's the first person in years who's ever spoken to her in a way she could answer. Sarah nodded, folding her arms lightly across her chest, not defensively, just grounded. "Jake, my younger one, is deaf. We don't have much, but Tyler, he's always been the bridge between us and the world." There was no bragging in her voice, just quiet truth. Marcus studied her face for a moment. She looked tired, the kind of tired that didn't sleep away. But her eyes were clear, steady. She had strength. Not the curated, gym-toned strength of socialites and CEOs, but the strength of someone who keeps choosing to show up, even when it hurts. There was something deeply grounding about her. Marcus realized then how little he actually understood about the people who existed outside the carefully controlled perimeter of his world. And yet, standing here, sharing this fragile thread of connection with a stranger whose son had just unlocked something precious in his daughter, he felt something begin to shift. A quiet question formed in his mind, not one of judgment, but of genuine reflection. What truly makes a family? Emma couldn't stop talking. At lunch, in line for art class, while packing her bag, every moment was filled with the movement of her hands and the intensity of her gaze. Where once there had been cautious gestures and minimal expression, now there were stories. Animated, layered, joyful stories. She told her father about Tyler's notebook, about his brother Jake, about how he had signed the word garden wrong and made her laugh so hard she couldn't finish her apple. Marcus listened with rapt attention, following the flow of her signs, catching every fourth or fifth word but understanding far more than he used to. Her whole body seemed lighter, her steps faster, her drawings more colorful. He hadn't seen her this way in years. Not since Claire. And though he didn't say it aloud, he felt a new kind of gratitude rising in his chest, the kind that couldn't be bought or forced. Just as Claire had once told him, connection didn't come from planning, it came from presence. And now, because of one boy with a tattered notebook and the kind of heart you couldn't teach, his daughter had found a place for her voice. It started with a story. One simple story told across the lunch table in a flurry of signs, quick and casual, like it wasn't a secret. Tyler, seated beside Emma beneath the same tree where they always escaped the chaos of recess, pulled a crushed juice box from his backpack and shrugged when she looked questioningly at the half sandwich on wax paper. "I had the other half for breakfast," he signed, grinning as if it were no big deal. "Jake doesn't like peanut butter, so I trade with him. Sometimes we don't have enough for both of us, so we split." Emma tilted her head, frowning. "Don't the grown-ups help?" she asked. Tyler just shrugged again, but this time with a flicker of something deeper behind his eyes. "Mama tries. Sometimes she eats after we're in bed." The statement landed like a quiet blow, and Emma, still only 8, didn't know what to say. Her eyes dropped to her untouched granola bar. Without a word, she broke it in half and pushed one piece toward him. Tyler smiled but shook his head. "You don't have to." Emma pushed it again, firmer this time. "I want to," she replied, and he finally accepted it like it was something sacred. The next morning, Emma did something she'd never done before. She woke early, earlier than necessary, and tiptoed into the kitchen before the staff arrived. She wasn't hungry. She wasn't thinking about class. She had a mission. She scanned the pantry for something she could carry, something that wouldn't get crushed in her bag. She found a pack of butter cookies and quickly tucked them into the pocket of her school sweater. Then, thinking better of it, she wrapped them in a napkin and stuffed them inside her pencil case, folding the flap shut like it was a secret treasure chest. That day at lunch, she waited until Tyler had finished the first half of his sandwich, and while he talked about a comic he was making for Jake, she reached into her case and pulled out the bundle. Tyler blinked in surprise. "What's that?" he signed. "Cookies," she replied simply. "For you and Jake." He looked at them, then at her, then slowly pushed them back. "You don't have to." But this time Emma didn't budge. "You shared your lunch. I'm sharing mine." Tyler took them with a quiet nod, and though he said nothing, his smile, soft and vulnerable, lingered long after the cookies were gone. Meanwhile, Marcus had started paying closer attention to everything that surrounded his daughter's days. At first it had been simple observation, watching Emma from afar as she laughed and signed and smiled with a vibrancy he hadn't seen in years. But the more time passed, the more he found himself wanting to understand the boy who had ignited such change. And so, he asked questions. He watched. He waited. And soon enough, the truth began to surface. Subtle comments from teachers, remarks from staff, small signs that Tyler came from a life far different than the ones most students at Halston Academy knew. One afternoon when Marcus arrived early to pick up Emma, he noticed Tyler waiting outside with a backpack far too heavy for someone his size. There was no car waiting. No nanny. Just a woman walking quickly down the street, her clothes practical and worn, her hair pulled back in a messy braid. She reached Tyler and signed something quickly. He nodded, handed her a paper from his bag. That was when Marcus stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Excuse me. Are you Tyler's mother?" She turned to him, startled, then nodded cautiously. "Yes, I'm Sarah." Her voice was calm, but her eyes were wary. Marcus introduced himself with polite formality, unsure what tone to take. "Emma talks about Tyler every day. He's made quite an impression." Sarah looked relieved, though a flush rose to her cheeks. "He talks about her too. A lot. She's the first friend he's ever had that sees him." Her voice faltered, and for a brief moment she hesitated. Then, almost as if forcing herself, she added, "I know he's not like the other kids here. I know where we're from, what we look like. It's different." Marcus shook his head. "He's exactly what this place needs more of." She laughed a little bitterly. "Maybe, but that's not usually how people around here see it." He could see the effort it took her to keep her voice steady, to keep her chin lifted. "Emma offered Tyler cookies yesterday," she continued. "He said she brought them from home. I just wanted to say, I hope that's okay. I know this might look like..." She didn't finish a sentence. The shame tried to creep in, but something stronger took its place. "Thank you," she said instead, softly, sincerely. "Not for the cookies, for letting your daughter be kind. That doesn't always happen." The bond between the children deepened in the days that followed. Emma and Tyler began walking side by side everywhere, into class, into the lunchroom, onto the school bus. They made up signs for things that didn't exist yet, played games only they understood, and communicated without pause. Emma had started drawing again, not just doodles, but full-page stories, inspired by Tyler's tales about Jake. In one drawing, she gave them all capes, superheroes saving each other in silence. For the first time, Emma's art wasn't just an escape. It was a way of documenting joy. Tyler, in turn, began speaking more aloud, softly, practicing the voice he usually reserved for Jake. Around Emma, he felt brave. Quote, "They were two children from vastly different worlds, but something between them dissolved the space between. It wasn't just friendship. It was a survival instinct finding a match. And yet around them, the walls began to whisper." Parents glanced longer than necessary during pickups. Other children's conversations stopped when Emma walked by holding Tyler's notebook. The same people who had once ignored Emma now watched her with a new, uncomfortable curiosity, not because she had found a friend, but because of who that friend was. Emma didn't notice the shift at first. She was too busy living, too busy signing inside jokes, too busy slipping pieces of her lunch into Tyler's hands when she thought no one was looking. But Marcus noticed. He saw the way some parents averted their eyes during morning drop-off. He heard the comments, not openly cruel, but laced with condescension. "She's always been such a sweet girl. And now she's attached to that boy." The whispers didn't need volume to cut, and yet Marcus did nothing, not yet. He watched, gathering truth like tinder, knowing that when the fire came, it would come fast. But he also watched Emma, and in her, he saw something miraculous. His daughter, once isolated, now anchored. And it had all started with a boy who carried half a sandwich and more grace than most adults he knew. The more they gave to each other, drawings, cookies, signs, secrets, the more obvious it became. This was no ordinary friendship. It was a bridge, a lifeline, a quiet rebellion against everything they were supposed to believe, about who belonged and who didn't. Emma and Tyler didn't care about rules or hierarchy. They'd already built something stronger, something that couldn't be undone. The email came without a sender name, just a generic school address and the subject line, concern regarding parental conduct. Inside, the accusations were vague, almost calculated in their ambiguity, influence undue, potential boundary issues, questionable proximity to a donor family. It didn't mention Sarah by name, but it didn't need to. Everyone knew who it meant. The wording made it clear. A mother like her didn't belong in a place like Halston Academy. Within hours, the administrative chain kicked into motion. Marcus received the call while reviewing quarterly reports, a brief, uncomfortable request to attend a discretionary meeting regarding a situation that could potentially affect the learning environment. He agreed. Reluctantly, but something inside him had already begun to tighten. When he arrived, the air in the boardroom was different, cold not from temperature but tone. "We've received an anonymous concern," the director began, eyes flicking over a printed page. "Nothing formal, of course, but we are obligated to investigate." Marcus glanced at the language. It read like veiled prejudice dressed in policy. "This is about Sarah?" he asked plainly. No one answered. That silence was louder than anything. For the first time in years, Marcus, a man who owned buildings with his name on them, felt powerless. Across the city, Sarah answered the door to a knock that was too polite to be casual. A man in a collared shirt introduced himself as a representative from Child Protective Services. He didn't smile. "It's standard follow-up," he said, flipping open a folder without waiting to be invited in. Nothing personal, but everything about the visit felt personal. He asked questions about employment, housing, food access, and marked her responses without acknowledgement. "You work nights? You've moved twice in the past year? And your eldest walks your youngest home from school?" Sarah answered steadily at first, but her voice grew thinner with each repetition. He never looked at Tyler or Jake, who sat quietly on the couch watching. "Do they have separate beds? What's your monthly income? Has anyone expressed concern before?" She offered documentation. "Pay stubs. Utility bills. A signed note from the school confirming Tyler's early pickup permissions." Still, the man scribbled like none of it mattered. When he finally left, Sarah sat down hard in the chair near the door and stared at her hands. The shame wasn't in what had been said, it was in what had been implied, that her love might not be enough, that poverty alone was cause for suspicion. That night she couldn't sleep. Every moment she'd fought to survive, the double shifts, the nights she went hungry, the borrowed textbooks and hand-me-down jackets, it all played through her mind like a cruel joke. She had done everything right, and still someone had looked at her and decided she was dangerous. Not because of anything she did, but because of what she wasn't. Not married, not rich, not polished. And now her boys were at risk. She thought about the looks she'd felt lately at pickup, at the store, even from some teachers who used to smile and now barely nodded. Emma's kindness had changed Tyler, brought light back to him, yes, but it had also made them visible. Too visible. "If they want to take them from me," Sarah whispered to herself, "they'll have to chase me." She sat at the edge of her bed until sunrise, the decision forming slowly but solidly like stone. She wouldn't wait for a second visit. She wouldn't risk Jake being questioned. She wouldn't let Tyler carry the weight of someone else's hatred. She scribbled a note for the school office, packed the essentials, and woke her sons before dawn. "We're taking a break from school," she said gently. "Just for a while." Emma noticed the absence immediately. At first she thought Tyler was sick. He'd mentioned a cold earlier that week. But by midday, doubt crept in. No messages, no drawing exchange, no notebook on the bench. After school, she rushed home and tore through her backpack, looking for anything she might have missed. A sign, a note, a goodbye. Her father was on the phone, distracted, but when she signed frantically that something was wrong, he paused. "He wasn't there?" Marcus asked, standing. "At all?" Emma shook her head and signed again, slower this time. He didn't say goodbye. She sat on the floor in the middle of the living room, legs crossed, eyes wide, trying to understand what kind of world made someone vanish without warning. She opened her school planner, flipped to the attendance list, and scanned for his name. Her fingers hovered above the TS, and then she saw it, Tyler Mitchell, a clean black line drawn through his name. Not erased, not blank, just crossed out, like a mistake. Emma stared at it for a long time, not crying, just stunned. For the second time in her short life, someone important had disappeared. But this time, there were no grown-ups giving answers. When Marcus entered the room and saw her like that, still, crumpled, holding the planner like it was something sacred, he felt an ache he couldn't hide. He sat beside her and asked again what had happened, but Emma wouldn't sign. She just opened the planner and pointed. The line said more than words ever could. "I'll find out," he promised, but she didn't respond. That night she didn't eat dinner, she didn't draw, she didn't ask for a bedtime story. She just climbed into bed early and stared at the ceiling. Marcus stood at the door, helpless. He had tried to build her a world free of pain, and still, pain found its way in. Worse this time, it had taken the one thing that had brought her back to life. Across the city, Sarah sat in a motel room, staring at the same planner she had begged Tyler to leave behind. Someone might notice, she had told him, and you don't want her thinking you just vanished, but she hadn't been able to offer a better solution, not when fear was louder than hope. She clutched Jake's sleeping form against her and watched Tyler pretend to read a book. No one had said it aloud, but they all felt it. The cost of kindness had just been named. The next morning at school, Emma went straight to the attendance sheet. She'd never cared about it before, never needed to. But today it was all she had. She flipped to the M page again. The line was still there. Permanent. Formal. Someone had decided he was no longer part of their world. No warning, no reason, just a stroke of ink. The teacher asked her to take her seat, but Emma stood frozen, eyes locked on that single, cruel detail. That was when she knew. Tyler wasn't coming back. Not today. Maybe not ever. And still, no one had told her why. She sat down slowly, her fingers trembling. Her voice, the one she had found through signs, through trust, through shared cookies and laughter, suddenly felt useless again. What good were hands if there was no one to see them? What good was language if the person who made it come alive had vanished without a trace? In her mind, she kept replaying their last conversation, trying to find a clue she had missed. But there had been no goodbye, no warning, just absence. And a name, Tyler Mitchell, crossed off the list like it had never mattered at all. The change in Emma wasn't sudden. It unfolded like a curtain slowly falling across a stage. At first, Marcus thought she was tired. The days had been strange since Tyler's disappearance, and children processed loss in unpredictable ways. But soon it became undeniable. Emma wasn't tired. She was gone in a way that terrified him. She no longer touched her crayons. Her fingers, once vibrant with stories told through sign, now moved sparingly, reluctantly. When he asked her questions, she answered in brief, clipped gestures. Fine. Later. No. And then even those disappeared. At dinner, she pushed food around her plate until it was cold. When he brought her favorite dessert, she didn't look up. The silence wasn't the absence of speech, it was the absence of Emma. Marcus tried everything. He brought home a puppy. She turned away. He suggested a trip to Paris. She didn't sign a response. He hired a new interpreter, a warm woman with years of experience, but Emma didn't acknowledge her presence. It was like the spark that had flickered so brightly after meeting Tyler had been snuffed out, and Marcus was left holding the charred remains, not knowing how to relight it. He watched her with growing panic, remembering the years after Claire's death when Emma had retreated into herself, unreachable even to him. But back then she was younger. He had assumed it was grief. Now he realized he hadn't fully understood what it meant to be alone in silence, not until Emma had briefly known what it meant to be seen. Losing that kind of connection wasn't just a disappointment. It was a devastation. One afternoon after another failed attempt to coax her into drawing, he stepped outside her door and leaned against the hallway wall, pressing his hands against his face in frustration. "What am I missing?" he whispered aloud, as if some answer might echo back. He thought about calling the head of the school board, demanding to know why they hadn't protected the boy. He thought about tracking Sarah down, but he didn't even know her last name. Guilt was mounting in his chest, and it wasn't just for Emma. It was for the way he'd watched everything unravel without acting sooner. His daughter was disappearing before his eyes, and money, influence, connections, none of it was helping. For the first time, Marcus Thompson had no leverage. It was past midnight when he heard a muffled sound. Not quite crying, not quite speaking, just a rustle. The house was quiet, the staff long gone, and Marcus was still at his desk, pretending to work. Something told him to check on Emma. He moved quietly through the hallway and pushed open her door without knocking. She was curled up tightly, eyes shut, but not asleep. The moment he stepped inside, he noticed the lump beneath her pillow, not the shape of a stuffed animal or book. Gently, careful not to startle her, he lifted the edge of the pillow and pulled out the object, a faded, spiral-bound notebook with frayed corners and smudged covers. Tyler's notebook. He recognized it instantly. He'd seen it once during recess when the boy had proudly shown Emma a page of hand-drawn signs. He opened the cover and flipped through drawings, notes, reminders to himself like practice fingerspelling with Jake, and ask Emma her favorite sign. And then on the last page, in a rushed, unsteady hand, one sentence, "You are my best friend." The letters were crooked, childish, real. Marcus froze, notebook open in his lap as Emma turned toward him, eyes open now, glistening. She didn't need to sign anything. The message was already written. That sentence hit Marcus harder than any business betrayal or public scandal ever had. In those 6 words, he saw the truth of it all. Emma hadn't lost a playmate. She'd lost the first person who had made her feel whole. All the tutors, specialists, interpreters, none of them had made her laugh. Tyler had, and now he was gone. Not because of chance or circumstance, but because someone, possibly many someones, had decided he didn't belong. Marcus stood up slowly, walked to the door, and turned back once to look at his daughter. She watched him without blinking, the notebook still in his hands. "I'll fix this," he said, not expecting her to respond. She didn't. But for the first time in weeks, she didn't turn away either. That small shift was enough. Marcus walked out of the room with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Not the clarity of a CEO making a profitable decision. The clarity of a father finally understanding what needed to be done. Not to protect his image or keep the peace, but to fight for his daughter's heart, and maybe along the way fight for something bigger than himself. By dawn, Marcus was already on the phone with his media team. Not his PR handlers, they would have begged him to stay quiet, but the journalists he'd met in his younger years, the ones who still owed him favors or respected him enough to listen. He drafted a statement by hand before the sun had fully risen, crossed out entire paragraphs, rewrote every line until it burned with truth. Not carefully worded damage control, but something braver, something human. He called the head of the school board and told them they'd be hearing his side publicly before the day was over. When they pushed back, hinted at reputational risk, Marcus didn't flinch. "If you think reputation matters more than what you allowed to happen," he said, "then you've already lost yours." He put on a plain suit, no tie, and left his house without his usual entourage. The driver waited, unsure of the plan. "Downtown," Marcus said. "Channel 4 first." The weight on his shoulders was heavy but no longer paralyzing. The decision had been made. He would speak. Loudly, clearly, not just for Emma but for Tyler, for Sarah, for every child silenced by a system too rigid to bend toward empathy. That morning the world saw a different Marcus Thompson, not the man from glossy magazine covers or tech conference stages, but a father sitting alone at a press table, speaking with fire in his voice and grief in his eyes. He didn't hide the facts. He told the truth. About Emma, about Tyler, about Sarah's kindness and the cruelty of silence weaponized by cowardice. He named no names, but everyone knew who he meant. "They erased a child," he said. "They made my daughter believe her joy was conditional." Reporters listened, stunned. Some wrote fast, others just watched. And somewhere, hundreds of miles away, in a motel room barely big enough for 3 people, Sarah Mitchell sat frozen in front of a small television as Marcus Thompson, billionaire, widower, father, began to rewrite not just his story, but hers too. Emma back home didn't say much that day, but when she saw the replay later and Marcus looked straight into the camera and signed "Thank you," Tyler with trembling hands, she smiled for the first time in weeks. The silence wasn't gone, but something else had returned. Not noise, not sound, but hope. When Marcus Thompson sat down in front of the cameras, there was no podium, no teleprompter, and no calculated branding behind him. There was only a man holding a small stack of papers in one hand and his daughter's silence in the other. He didn't wear his signature suit. No designer cufflinks. Just a plain gray jacket and eyes ringed with exhaustion. The journalists didn't know what to expect. Some thought it might be a preemptive legal defense. Others suspected corporate damage control. But when Marcus opened his mouth, what came out wasn't a statement from a CEO. It was a confession from a father who had finally learned how to speak. "My name is Marcus Thompson," he began, his voice raw. "But more importantly, I'm Emma's father. And today I am not here to protect my reputation. I am here to protect the truth." He held up a photograph. Emma and Tyler sitting side by side, laughing silently, her hands mid-gesture, his eyes locked onto hers. She wasn't pretending. She wasn't being polite. She was alive. And for the first time in her life, my daughter was not alone. The room stilled. It wasn't spin. It was heartbreak. He told them everything. About the notebook he found under her pillow, about the lunchbox filled with untouched food, about the abrupt withdrawal of a boy who had done nothing more than be kind. "This is Tyler," he said, showing another photo, one Sarah had emailed him weeks ago. of her sons in mismatched jackets beaming in front of a bus stop. And this is Jake, his little brother, who Tyler takes care of like a parent. And this, he held up a folded piece of lined paper, is what Tyler left behind. You are my best friend. Marcus let the silence land before continuing. I've made many deals in my life. I've lost millions in failed ventures. But nothing has ever cost me more than watching my daughter's heart close again. He didn't name the accuser. He didn't have to. His message wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice, about refusing to let whispers and prejudice erase what had been real for two children. If kindness between children is now a risk, he said, then we've built a world too cruel to be proud of. The cameras kept rolling. The silence after his words wasn't awkward. It was sacred. By the time the press conference ended, Marcus had broken every rule his advisors had begged him to follow. He had offered no apology to investors, no assurance to partners. Instead, he offered truth. Vulnerable, undeniable truth. Within hours, the story exploded online. News outlets replayed the footage. Blogs translated it into 12 languages. Comment sections overflowed with stories. Parents of children with disabilities recounting the loneliness their kids endured. The moments when one friend changed everything. One mother wrote, "We've waited years for someone like Marcus Thompson to say what we feel every day." Donations flooded into foundations that supported deaf children, special education programs, and inclusive communication training. Emma's school was inundated with letters, some in speech, others in sign, others still in shaky handwriting from children who knew what it meant to be misunderstood. But amidst the outpouring of support, one name remained absent. Sarah. No messages, no phone calls, no sign of Tyler or Jake. The more Marcus searched, the more he realized they hadn't just left the school, they had disappeared. Every night Marcus combed through messages, emails, leads. Some said they saw Sarah at a shelter upstate. Others thought she'd gone back to her hometown. None were confirmed. He hired private investigators, but they came up empty or returned with conflicting reports. She's afraid, Marcus told his assistant, not of me, of what people did to her kids. And he wasn't wrong. The day after the social worker's visit, Sarah had packed 2 duffel bags and slipped out before sunrise. She left no forwarding address, no goodbye. Only silence, the kind that felt final. Marcus sat in Emma's room one night holding her hand while she slept and wondered aloud, what if I waited too long? Emma stirred, and even in sleep her fingers curled as if signing in dreams. He didn't understand the gestures, but he understood the message. She missed him. And she was still waiting. That thought burned in his chest like a challenge. Not the kind with money or negotiations, the kind that demanded humility, effort, and relentless love. The kind of challenge only a father could rise to. Publicly, Marcus was praised. Privately, he paid a heavy price. Board members distanced themselves. Contracts were quietly severed. Friends who once toasted to his success stopped answering calls. They think I've lost my mind, he said during an interview. Let them. I'd rather lose everything than lose my daughter again. Financial advisors called to warn about the impact of his stance. PR consultants offered to help reframe the narrative. He declined them all. What mattered most now wasn't perception, it was restoration. For every bridge that burned, a letter arrived that made it worth it. A father from Chicago wrote, "Your daughter's story gave me the courage to ask my son how he really feels." A girl from Minnesota mailed. Emma a drawing of 2 kids signing the word friend. These weren't statistics. They were proof. And yet every night when Marcus closed his eyes, he saw the same image. Sarah walking away with her sons, head down, afraid to look back. It haunted him. Not just because of what it meant for Emma, but because he now knew that his silence had once allowed it. And still Sarah did not answer. He sent messages through old contacts, emailed every address he could guess, left voicemails that started hopeful and ended defeated. Emma asked fewer questions each day. Her silence was no longer hard. It was resigned. She had started carrying Tyler's notebook in her backpack again, almost like a ritual, something sacred to remind her that it had all been real. And Marcus, despite the applause and the praise, knew that the story was not finished. A father's voice had reached the world, but not the one person it was meant to reach. And until it did, nothing else would be enough. Marcus had read the word Millfield at least a dozen times before it began to feel real. It came from a folded note passed discreetly by Emma's teacher after class. She asked me once where Tyler might go if something ever happened, the teacher had whispered. She said he had a grandma up north. That was all it took. Marcus didn't even finish his coffee before canceling his meetings and packing an overnight bag. He knocked gently on Emma's door, signed her name, and when she opened her eyes, he He showed her a sticky note with a single word written in thick black ink. Millfield. Her gaze flickered, hesitant at first, then lit up with something he hadn't seen in days. Hope. They didn't talk much during the preparation. He didn't ask if she was sure. She didn't ask where Millfield was. It didn't matter. What mattered was that there was a place, a dot on the map, where Tyler might still exist, not as a memory, but as a living, breathing boy who had once called her his best friend. At 4:32 a.m. the engine started, and they began the long drive toward what could be a reunion or closure. The miles passed slowly, but not heavily. Emma didn't fidget or stare out the window aimlessly like she used to. Instead, she sat quietly with Tyler's notebook in her lap, flipping through pages she had memorized by heart, pausing at the ones that still made her smile. About halfway through the drive, she reached over and placed her hand on Marcus's arm, a small gesture but a powerful one. He looked over briefly and saw her sign, "Thank you." He couldn't respond properly without taking his hands off the wheel, so he just nodded and blinked a few times to keep the tears from blurring the road. They stopped for gas once, and he bought her the same kind of juice box Tyler used to bring to school. She didn't drink it, just held it, cradled it. It was a sense of ritual in every little thing she did. As they drove through Vermont's winding back roads, Marcus felt a strange peace. For once, he wasn't solving anything with money. He was simply showing up fully, honestly, and without conditions. And that, it seemed, was all Emma had needed. By the time they reached Millfield, it was past noon. A quiet sign welcomed them with peeling paint and a bent nail. Marcus didn't need GPS to know where to go. The town was small, the kind of place where every direction was both right and wrong depending on how slow you were willing to drive. Emma sat up straighter, clutching her notebook, scanning every porch and backyard like a detective chasing a memory. Marcus's hands were tense on the steering wheel again. Doubt crept in. What if this was a dead end? What if Sarah had never come here? But then, just as they turned onto a gravel road that looked like it hadn't been paved in decades, Emma gasped. She pointed toward a small yellow house with chipped siding and a porch swing swaying slightly in the breeze. He parked the car, but she didn't wait. Before he could even unbuckle his seatbelt, Emma was out the door, her feet kicking up dust as she ran. Marcus followed behind her, stumbling slightly over a rock in the driveway, heart pounding, not from the run but from the sight in front of him. There, beneath a canopy of half-bare trees, stood 3 figures. Sarah was crouched low, gathering dry leaves into Jake's small hands, while Tyler stood beside them, tossing handfuls into the air like confetti. None of them saw Emma at first. She was too fast, too silent, and then she was there, a blur of motion, crashing into Tyler with such force that both children tumbled to the ground in a heap of limbs and laughter and stunned disbelief. Tyler's arms wrapped around her instantly, almost reflexively, like he had been waiting to do exactly that. They didn't speak, not with words, they didn't need to. Their hands moved quickly, sloppily, signs overlapping, sometimes messy, sometimes perfect. But their eyes never left each other. It was as if the days apart had been nothing but a pause in an unfinished sentence. And now, it was being written again. Sarah stood slowly, her eyes wide with shock and the beginnings of tears. Marcus finally reached them, slightly breathless, unsure of whether to approach or wait. Sarah's gaze found his, and something passed between them, an unspoken apology, maybe, or just mutual recognition. "You found us," she said softly, almost like a question. "We had to," Marcus replied. He didn't try to justify anything. He didn't mention the press conference or the letters or the headlines. He just looked at her, at Tyler, at Jake, and back at Emma, who now looked more alive than he had seen her in weeks. Sarah exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly, the kind of release that only comes after weeks of survival mode living. She walked toward him with slow steps and said, "I wasn't hiding, I was just trying to protect them." Marcus nodded. "I know, but she needed to know you were safe, that he was safe." Sarah looked at Emma, then at her sons. Maybe we all needed that. No more was said. No more needed to be. And in that small backyard in Millfield, Vermont, surrounded by leaves and silence and the echoes of almost lost friendship, Marcus knew something with total clarity. It wasn't a grand gesture, it wasn't a deal or a speech or a donation. It was this: Emma running, Tyler catching her, Jake smiling up at both of them like he already knew the ending, and Sarah standing beside him, not asking for anything, just being there. As Marcus stood quietly watching the scene unfold, his daughter clinging to a boy who had once saved her in a schoolyard, he understood that this was what he had come for. Not closure, not justice, just them, together again. And in that single moment, with no need for words, he finally felt it. He had found exactly what he was looking for. The kitchen floor was modest, scuffed in places. the linoleum curling slightly at the corners, but none of that mattered. Marcus sat cross-legged beside Sarah, a mug of hot chamomile tea warming his hands, though he hadn't taken a sip. Between them lay a plate of thick, uneven slices of homemade bread, still warm from the oven. Jake had helped knead the dough earlier that morning, Sarah had said. Her voice carried none of the polished cadence Marcus was used to hearing in his usual circles. Instead, it trembled with fatigue, with truth. For the first time since they'd met, there were no shields, no carefully chosen words, no second-guessing. She spoke plainly, almost abruptly at times, but Marcus found it refreshing, necessary even. Some nights I'd stare at the ceiling, praying Tyler wouldn't hear my stomach growling, Sarah confessed. I used to be proud, you know. But pride doesn't feed kids. Her eyes flickered toward the doorway, where Tyler and Emma were now giggling silently, Jake between them copying her signs like a baby bird learning to fly. I never wanted your world, Marcus, she continued. I just wanted mine to stop collapsing. Marcus didn't interrupt. He just listened, really listened. He finally spoke after a long silence. When Claire died, I convinced myself that if I kept everything under control, if I made her room look untouched, if I answered every question from Emma with a smile, I could protect her from the hole in our house. His voice cracked, and he didn't hide it. But you can't protect someone from silence by pretending it's not there. He looked down, gathering his words. I kept hiring experts and therapists, thinking they'd fix what I couldn't, but the truth is, I never knew how to be enough for her. Sarah's expression softened. She didn't offer pity, that wasn't her way, but something in her shifted. The distance between their worlds began to shrink, not because one had crossed into the other, but because they had finally stopped pretending they weren't both built on grief. She laid a hand lightly on his arm. You were trying to be everything, she said, but sometimes what kids need most isn't perfection, it's presence. And love, even the clumsy, awkward kind. They both glanced over at Emma, who was now helping. Jake traced the letters in FAR-IND on the back of an old envelope while Tyler drew crooked hearts around them. I judged you, Marcus admitted. At first, not out loud, but I did. I saw your worn shoes, the calluses on your hands, and I thought you were surviving because you had no choice. But you were choosing. Every single day you were choosing to stay, to fight, to love. His voice had steadied, but his heart was still raw. You didn't run until someone pushed you too far, and I let that happen. Sarah blinked hard, then shook her head. You didn't make that call. Someone else did. Someone who couldn't stand seeing different worlds connect. She took a breath. But you came after us. That counts for something. For a few moments they sat in silence again. Not awkward silence. Healing silence. One that didn't need to be filled. Emma lifted Jake's hand, guided him as he shaped the word friend in the air, letter by letter, as if casting a spell. And for the first time since Millfield had come into view, Marcus smiled without effort. He felt like someone who had been trying to read in the dark for too long, and now, finally, there was a light. Jake crawled over and settled beside Sarah, pressing his head against her arm. She smoothed his hair with a kind of unconscious tenderness that Marcus had only ever seen in mothers who'd fought too hard to relax. Tyler passed Emma a new sheet of paper, and she started drawing a house, simple and boxy, with 4 stick figures holding hands. Marcus watched her hands move with precision and grace, each line infused with meaning. He recognized the figures: Emma, Tyler, Jake, and him. Sarah noticed too. She draws you taller than everyone else, she whispered. She always does. Marcus laughed quietly. It's the only way she'll ever see me as a superhero, he said. She doesn't need a superhero, Sarah replied. She needs a dad who stays. Her words landed softly, but they shook something loose inside him. He looked down at his hands that had closed deals, signed contracts worth millions, held award statues, and shaken political figures. But they had never held a question as fragile, as hopeful as the one he was about to ask. I don't know how this works, he began slowly, nervously. I'm not even sure it's the right thing to say here now. But I can't leave this house and pretend that today didn't happen. He paused, then looked directly into her eyes. What if we tried to be something more than people brought together by tragedy? What if we stopped thinking of our families as separate? He hesitated, then added, what if we tried being a family? Sarah stared at him. For a moment, Marcus feared he had ruined everything. But then she smiled, not wide, not dramatic. Just enough. Enough to tell him she had heard every word. She reached across the bread plate and took his hand. That's a big question, she said. And it's not something I can answer for all of us. She glanced at her boys. But maybe. Maybe it's a question worth living into. She didn't say yes, she didn't say no. But Marcus knew, in that kitchen, between the warmth of homemade bread and the echo of childhood laughter, that the answer had already started to grow. And so they remained there, Marcus and Sarah side by side, Emma tracing the word family into Jake's palm, Tyler doodling next to her with quiet intensity, all of them held together not by obligation, not by wealth or pity or coincidence, but by the sheer force of what had been built silently, patiently, in between the broken spaces of their lives. There was no grand declaration, no perfectly worded agreement, just a question planted in the air, delicate and unspoken. What if? And in that simple, unfinished thought, something new began to take root. A shift, a bond, a home not yet fully formed, but finally possible. In that modest kitchen, between slices of bread and the soft gestures of belonging, Marcus whispered what he hadn't dared to say aloud until now, a prayer wrapped in a proposal. What if we tried to be a family? Marcus wasn't nervous, not in the way men typically are when down on one knee. He wasn't asking for permission to love. He'd already been loving in silence for months, loving in the way he listened to Sarah's exhaustion without trying to fix it, loving in how he learned to read Emma's quiet language of emotion, loving in how he stopped needing to be right and started needing to be real. And now, in the garden of their new home, not a mansion, but a place with roots and laughter, he knelt not with a velvet box, but with an old envelope, its corners worn from being held too tightly, too long. Inside, 2 documents. The first, adoption papers for Tyler and Jake, carefully reviewed, notarized, ready to be signed. The second, a handwritten letter, not perfect but sincere. At the top, one simple question. Will you marry me? Not because I can give you everything, but because I want to give you us. The kids watched from a few feet away. Tyler grinned. Emma's eyes sparkled. Jake held a dandelion in one hand, clapping with the other, not knowing what the moment meant but feeling its magic all the same. Sarah's reaction wasn't theatrical. She didn't gasp or cover her mouth or ask if he was serious because she already knew he was. Her tears didn't come from surprise, but from the soft and overwhelming release of years spent holding it all together. She didn't cry because Marcus offered her a future. She cried because for the first time she didn't have to carry it alone. You want to adopt them? She whispered, her voice cracking. Not as a gesture, as a commitment, Marcus replied, unwavering. They're already mine in every way that matters. I just want the law to catch up with our hearts. She laughed through her tears and shook her head, not in denial, but in disbelief that someone could see them so clearly. Do you know how many doors have closed on us? She asked. Do you know how many people looked at my boys and saw burden instead of brilliance? Marcus looked at her, really looked. I see them, he said simply. I see you. And that was the moment Sarah stopped fighting the current of her own fear and let herself drift into something she never thought she'd find again. Safety. The yes didn't explode. It bloomed. It wasn't shouted. It was offered like a gift being unwrapped with care. Yes, Sarah whispered, almost like a secret. Yes to all of it. And just like that, something shifted, not just in them, but in the space around them. Emma clapped her hands silently, her fingers moving fast in signs that only Tyler could translate in time. We're a family. A real one. Jake looked up at Sarah and asked, Does that mean we're not moving anymore? And she bent down, kissed his forehead, and said, We're staying. Tyler ran over, threw his arms around Marcus, and didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He had spent years communicating with his brother through touch and silence. Now that language wrapped itself around a new father. Marcus held him, and the boy's heartbeat slowed. For the first time, he let himself believe that this home, these people, wouldn't vanish. The ripple effect came fast. Marcus didn't shield this new chapter from the world, he embraced it publicly. He posted the story not through a PR firm or corporate campaign, but in his own voice. Raw, vulnerable, unpolished. A caption on a photo. They didn't need saving. I did, the media exploded. Some called it performative, others called it brave. Marcus didn't care. He didn't respond to the headlines. He responded to the hundreds of emails from families who had felt invisible. Sarah was approached by a team within Marcus's company. Would she consider leading an initiative on accessibility and inclusion? She hesitated at first. I clean houses. I don't run departments, she said. But Marcus reminded her, You've been leading your whole life. Now people are finally ready to listen. She said yes again, not because she wanted power, but because she knew what it felt like to be shut out of spaces that were never built with you in mind. Now she was ready to change that, brick by brick. Their house transformed in quiet ways. The walls were covered not in art from galleries, but in crayon drawings, school awards, and a growing wall of sticky notes with things like "first tooth lost" or "Jake read a whole page today." Emma no longer slept with the lights on. Tyler started inviting friends over. Jake learned how to ride a bike, and when he fell, it was Marcus, not a caseworker, not a stranger, who knelt down, cleaned the scrape, and said, "Let's try again." Sarah started singing again while doing dishes, off-key and carefree. And Marcus, the man who once scheduled love between meetings, now left his phone face down, unread. They weren't perfect. Some nights still ended in arguments about curfews or missed chores. But the difference now was this: no one ever walked away. Not anymore. And so in the garden where Emma and Tyler had planted daisies with muddy hands and grinning faces, Marcus remained kneeling, not because he hadn't risen, but because this moment deserved to be remembered exactly as it was. Sarah's hands held the envelope close to her chest like something sacred. Emma laughed. Not a sound, but a laugh nonetheless, with a mouth wide open and eyes shining. Jake clapped until his hands turned red, spinning in small circles. That yes echoed in more than words. It changed dinner tables, school records, last names. It changed how they saw themselves. But most of all, it changed the story they thought they were destined to live, no longer surviving separately. Now, finally, building together. Months had passed, but for Marcus, the memory of the first time he saw Emma signed to Tyler in the schoolyard remained as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. Now seated in the front row of the newly inaugurated Center for Educational Inclusion, he watched his daughter step onto the stage with Tyler and Jake, a calm confidence in her every movement. She didn't look back for reassurance. She didn't need to. She knew where her family sat, and more importantly, she knew who she was. As the audience settled into silence, the three children stood together side by side, facing a crowd that included teachers, parents, public figures, and children with and without disabilities. Emma raised her hands first, her fingers forming shapes so precise, so alive, that the story began even before Tyler joined in. Their narrative unfolded without a single spoken word, but with a clarity that transcended any language. It was the story of a girl who lived in silence, a boy who refused to ignore it, and the father who chose to listen with something deeper than ears. It wasn't just performance, it was testimony, it was truth. Backstage, Sarah had told the kids they could stop any time if they felt nervous, but they never hesitated. Jake had insisted on wearing a tie, one that didn't match but made him feel like a boss. He stood between his brother and Emma, his small hands mimicking their movements a few seconds behind, his eyes darting from one to the other to make sure he was keeping up. The audience didn't mind. They watched in stillness, their attention gripped not by spectacle but by sincerity. When Tyler signed, he learned to hear her, even when no one else could, and Emma followed with, "And we taught him that silence is not empty." Something shifted in the room. Many wept. Others reached for the hands of those beside them. And somewhere in the back, a little girl nudged her mother and whispered, "I want to learn how to talk like that." On stage, Emma turned to Jake and placed a hand on his shoulder, signing slowly, "Your voice matters." He didn't understand every word, but he understood her smile. He mirrored it, and the audience smiled with him. Marcus sat motionless, a mix of awe and humility anchoring him to his seat. Claire was everywhere in his thoughts, not as a ghost of grief, but as a part of the love that had grown in ways neither of them could have imagined. He remembered the nights when he feared Emma might never laugh again, when silence in their house wasn't peaceful but punishing. Now, he couldn't believe the girl in front of him was the same child who once scribbled on the corners of books just to feel heard. His gaze shifted to Sarah beside him, her hand resting gently on his, her eyes moist but proud. She hadn't needed the spotlight. Her place was beside her children, giving them the roots to stay grounded and the courage to reach. And now her children stood in front of hundreds, showing the world what inclusion truly looked like, not charity, not tolerance, but equity, empowerment, and pride. When the story concluded, the applause didn't come all at once. There was a breath, a shared breath, where everyone seemed to hold the moment together, reluctant to let it end. Then a single clap, then another, and then a wave of standing ovation that shook the air around them. Emma grinned, turning to Tyler and Jake as if to say, "We did it." Tyler placed his hand over his heart, then reached for hers. Jake bowed dramatically, then pointed to the front row, where Marcus and Sarah stood clapping like parents who had seen the world change, not in grand speeches, but in the hands of their children. That moment wasn't about celebration alone. It was about witness. Everyone in that room had just seen a new kind of language, not just signs, but choices made from love, pain, persistence, and hope. Afterward, when the crowd began to disperse and the cameras stopped flashing, Emma stayed on stage for a few extra seconds, watching the seats empty one by one. She held her hands against her chest as if protecting the story they had just told. Marcus walked up to her and lifted her gently into his arms. "You told it better than I ever could have," he said, his voice steady but quiet, meant just for her. She looked at him, signed slowly. "You heard it, didn't you?" He nodded. Every word. Sarah joined them, resting her head on his shoulder as the three of them stood there, taking it all in. Tyler and Jake came running, arms full of papers and markers from a craft table someone had forgotten to clean up. "We need more colors next time," Jake announced. Purple didn't show up well on the board. It was such a normal thing to say, and yet it anchored everything. They weren't just special kids doing special things. They were kids, period. And they were finally being seen that way. The story ended just as it had begun, with hands telling truths that voices never could. Emma, Tyler, and Jake had stood before the world and spoken from a place that had once been unreachable. Marcus had watched not as a billionaire or a grieving husband, but as a father who had finally learned that love isn't proven in the big gestures, it's revealed in the small ones. Sarah, who once packed lunches at dawn and walked miles to jobs that paid little, now stood as the woman who helped reshape the landscape of education for every child who felt like an outsider. And as they walked off the stage together, hand in hand, Marcus knew this wasn't the closing of their story. It was the first chapter of something honest, raw, and beautifully real. Not a fairy tale, a life, built not on perfection, but on the kind of love brave enough to stay. This story took us days of care, listening, and love to bring to life. And we created it thinking of people like you, who feel every word, every silence, and every gesture. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. What part moved you most? Leave us a comment. Your words mean more to us than you imagine. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. Every new subscriber helps us continue crafting stories that bring meaning, comfort, and hope to homes like yours. Your support, a like, a comment, or a simple share is what keeps this space alive. From our family to yours, thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story.